So they're talking about a poverty reduction plan that the Ontario government brought in 2014, and they're talking about how it's fairly ambitious, and they've got poverty advocates here saying that they're pleasantly surprised by the language, but there's a couple of things I want to tweak, and it's a far cry from the kinds of things that you see in a lot of other places, even in Canada. The Liberal government we have in Ontario right now is quite progressive. One of the things they did, for example, is they indexed the minimum wage to inflation, meaning that the minimum wage goes up every year by whatever inflation goes up by, right? So if we have a bad batch of inflation, we have inflation at 10%, then the minimum wage will go up 10%, which will be which is significant, right? Um, I guess on an average year it's going to go up, 10 cents to a quart or something like that. Although as it rises, it'll be going up more and more and more. Um, but people are saying, I think it's set at about $12 right now. One of the poverty advocates here is like, well, it's set it to 14. You know, and it does make a big difference when you're making small incomes, right? Um, the $2 an hour is a big deal. When you're talking about 12 or 14, it's substantial, right? But I just want to point out how what this really demonstrates is that the minimum wage is something that needs to be set locally. Okay. When she says 14, that's what that is a more of a Toronto specific number, right? What she's doing is she's saying, I'm going to look at the most expensive area in the country, or sorry, in the province, the most expensive area in the province, and I'm going to suggest that we should set it to that, right? So that way everybody gets, what they need, and if you're in poorer areas, um, you'll be that much better off, right? Obviously, the government can't do that, right? What the government is going to do is an average, right? And Ontario is a big province. It's, I mean, if you could, the most populated area between Windsor and Montreal, Montreal's in Quebec, and or between Detroit and Montreal, right? If you look at a map, kind of up that strip, is about the same size as the eastern seaboard, right? And then there's this huge area off the side that's like, I mean, it's like the entire eastern half of the United States, right? It's a big province. And so you can imagine that, and in fact, there's huge disparities. Um, Toronto is in many ways sort of the exit point of the eastern part of the continent, right? Toronto is, I mean, if you look at North America, and you move out, you've got New York, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Toronto, like it's like and the same thing with Montreal and Ottawa, right? And maybe we could say Ottawa is the exit point because it's a little bit further north, but that part of southern Ontario is very much integrated into the rest of the continent, right? It's just on the other side of the border, but for all basic economic purposes, it's integrated, right? But then when you go up into northern Ontario, up into Thunder Bay or Sudbury, like I believe there's one road that'll take you to Thunder Bay. And if the road is closed, you can't get you've got a helicopter in, right? And in fact, most of the province is only accessible by helicopter. There's no roads. Now you can imagine that. I mean, there's not a lot of economic activity there, right? But I mean, there are some centers there. You've got Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie. Did I say Sudbury or Thunder Bay first? I think I said Sudbury, didn't I? You've got Thunder Bay, Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie. You have a lot of small towns even in the south, like Cornwall, Brockville, Kingston, where I am in Windsor, Sarnia. Most of the areas outside Toronto and Ottawa have substantially lower standards of living, or sorry, not standards, but costs of living. Standards of living are probably actually higher because the cost of living are lower. Um, so when you work it out as an average, you end up with two things that happen, right? Number one, you end up with the fact that the cost of living outside Toronto and Ottawa, those are the two major centers, the cost of living outside Toronto and Ottawa is lower than it is in Toronto and Ottawa. So that takes the average down. But then the flip side of that is that the cost of living in Toronto, which is like half the province population size, right? Like half the province of Ontario is in the city of Toronto. And a good chunk of the rest of it's in Ottawa, right? Together, they make up something like 70% of the population. So what they do is they boost it up, right? And so the result is that if you're outside of those two major population centers and you're living on disability or on the minimum wage or any sort of lower income situation or poverty level situation, you're way better off outside the cities, right? Because all of the metrics, I mean, the disability is determined by the province using the same sort of thing. The minimum wage is determined by the province. You're way better off because the cost of living is so much lower, and the fact that the cost of living in Toronto is high inflates what it is that you get. The flip side of that is that if you're in Toronto, then you end up poor because the fact that the cost of living outside Toronto is low brings the average down. So what's the answer? Well, if you're outside Toronto, you're probably saying, you know what, like I am, you're probably saying, I don't need to change this. This is fine, and it's true. I mean, look at the life that I live, right? I'm vlogging here. You can see the life that I live. It's pretty cushy, right? I've got a nice place to live. I have sufficient spending money. I mean, last month I was, once I got to the sixth concert that month, I had to sell some CDs. That's pretty cushy, right? Um, I don't have a reason for things to change, right? But I moved here. I grew up in Ottawa. I got out of there because the cost of living was higher there, right? I was able to figure that out, right? I mean, not everybody can do that, right? But I mean, if you are outside, you know, but if you're inside one of the major centers, you might want to argue that the minimum wage should be set not by the province, or at least maybe it should be set by the province, but there should also be a city wage that's higher than what the province sets, right? So you have a minimum level of the province and then have a city, right? And so this is kind of, I mean, there's two things to take away from this. Number one, I think that if you're an advocate for this in Ontario, you should be fighting for like a city hall kind of thing, right? Like I say, I don't know if I don't know exactly what the legality of that is. If I remember correctly, I think that actually they would have to pass it at Queen's Park. But you should be looking at rather than having the whole province, because, like I say, if you're living in Windsor, you're probably doing okay on minimum wage. You know, unless maybe you shouldn't have had the fourth kid. And I'm sorry, but that's reality, right? If you're living on minimum wage and you're living by yourself, then you're doing okay. And if you're living with kids, then I think rather than boost the minimum wage, you should be eligible for subsidies, right? I don't think that it's the market's responsibility to pay for your kids. I think that's government's responsibility, right? But I mean, like, I don't think there's a problem with the minimum wage outside the major cities. There is one inside the major cities, right? So if you're an advocate, let's focus on that. And number two, if you're outside of Ontario, I think that looking at the situation on Ontario can yield a lot of lessons as to, I mean, Ontario is, I'm going to guess, is probably twice the size of California. I mean, not population size. Population size, there's more people in California than there is in all of Canada. But in terms of like geography size, I'd guess that Ontario is roughly twice the size of California. Okay, so that's to kind of put it in perspective. Um, and then there's lessons to be learned about trying to put a minimum wage down over too large of an area. It has to be specific to the economics of a region, and it has to be local. Um, and I think that if you want real gains real victories, real movements forward, that has to be the way that it's looked at. Is it's a local issue, and there's positive ramifications of that as well. My ass is gonna blow. I gotta go to the bathroom.